10,000 years ago, in a hard, dry band of land curving through what is now Iraq and Syria, human beings did something that had never been done before. In a country of little rain and punishing sun, they stopped wandering, settled down, and built the first cities. They learned to channel the waters of great rivers across parched fields, to grow grain in surplus, to write, to trade, to govern. This was the birth of civilization itself, and it happened not in some gentle paradise, but on the edge of the desert, in a place that gave nothing easily and had to be fought into yielding a settled life. From that first act, a profound and enduring truth was established, one that has shaped the entire history of the Middle East. That here, civilization has always been a thing built against the desert, wrested from an environment that would, if left alone, reclaim it. And now that ancient contest has entered a new and uncertain phase, because the desert, degree by degree, is beginning to press back against everything civilization has built to hold it off. This is the story of that contest, a reassertion that is neither the sudden collapse that alarmists imagine, nor a threat that can safely be ignored, but something more interesting than either, a genuine, deepening struggle whose outcome no one can yet know. To understand what may now be at stake, we have to appreciate what was accomplished, and how astonishing it was. The land between the Tigris and the Euphrates was not naturally hospitable to dense settlement. It was hot and dry, and the rains that would water crops were sparse and unreliable. The people who settled there could not simply plant and harvest. They had to bring the water to the fields themselves, digging canals across the dry ground, managing floods, storing water against drought, coordinating the enormous collective labor such systems demanded. It was the mastery of water in a dry land that made everything else possible, because the surplus food that irrigation produced freed some people from farming to become priests and scribes and kings, and it was that division of labor that gave rise to writing, to law, to the state, to all the apparatus of civilization. The first cities of the world rose from the desert's edge on the strength of this achievement, and the same pattern repeated along the Nile, where ancient Egypt was built entirely on the mastery of a single river running through absolute desert. From its very origins, civilization in this region was an act of defiance against the desert, a structure erected against an environment that never stopped pressing in. It is worth lingering on just how radical this first achievement was, because familiarity has dulled our sense of its strangeness. For the overwhelming majority of human existence, our ancestors lived as small bands of hunter-gatherers, moving with the seasons, never staying anywhere long enough to build anything permanent. To settle in one place, to gather thousands and then tens of thousands of people into a single dense community, was to defy the fundamental logic of how humans had always lived. And to do it in a hot, dry land, where the natural productivity of the environment was low, was to compound that defiance many times over. It required not just the discovery of agriculture, but the invention of an entire apparatus for managing scarcity, systems for storing grain against the lean years, for allocating water among competing users, for organizing the vast collective labor the canals demanded, for keeping the records such organization required, which is very likely why writing itself was invented here. Born from the mundane necessity of tracking who owed what grain and water to whom. The desert, in other words, did not merely provide the backdrop for civilization. It was, in a real sense, the crucible that forced civilization into being, because only by developing the sophisticated institutions of collective management could human beings thrive in such a demanding place. The very difficulty of the environment was the mother of the invention. This is a paradox worth holding on to, that the desert has always been not only civilization's adversary, but also, in a strange way, its maker, the hard teacher whose lessons produced the first cities and the first written words. And here we come to a pattern that runs through the region's entire history, one that gives the title's motif its deep resonance, because the desert has taken civilizations back before, and the ruins are still there to prove it. The mastery of the dry land was never permanent. It had to be maintained continuously, and when the maintenance faltered, the desert returned. In ancient Mesopotamia, the very irrigation that made the civilization possible slowly poisoned the soil with salt, because water evaporating in a hot climate leaves its dissolved salts behind, and over centuries this salinization crept across the fields and undermined the agricultural base on which the whole society rested. Other settlements and whole civilizations rose and faded, some undone by prolonged droughts that the climate records have since revealed. Cities that flourished for generations and were then abandoned to the sand. And here is the crucial detail. These collapses were rarely sudden. The salt crept in over centuries, so gradually that each generation barely noticed the difference from the last. The droughts looked at first like ordinary bad luck. It was precisely the slow, cumulative, easily overlooked kind of pressure, the kind that builds degree by degree rather than striking all at once, that has historically proven most dangerous to civilizations in this region, eroding the foundations while everyone looked elsewhere. The buried ruins scattered across the region are monuments to gradual failures of maintenance against a patient environment, and they stand as a warning about what happens when the slow pressures are allowed to win. Now let us leap across the millennia to the modern chapter, because what has happened in the region in the last several generations is a renewal of this ancient contest on a scale that would have been unimaginable to those first city builders. In the 20th century, the discovery of vast oil reserves transformed some of the poorest desert societies on Earth into some of the wealthiest. And with that wealth came the ambition and the means to attempt the most complete conquest of the desert ever undertaken. Where there had been small settlements of fishers and pearl divers, there arose within a single lifetime some of the most spectacular cities the world has ever seen. Dubai, Abu Dhabi, Doha, Riyadh, and their neighbors rose from the sand as forests of gleaming towers, cooled and lit and watered on a scale that defied everything the desert had always dictated. It was as though humanity, having spent 10,000 years negotiating cautiously with the desert, had suddenly decided to simply overpower it, to build the kind of dense, green, comfortable, water-rich civilization the environment had always forbidden. And for a time that continues still, it worked spectacularly. The modern Gulf is a genuine marvel, a demonstration that with enough wealth and technology, human beings can build a glittering metropolis even where the summer sun can kill and almost no fresh water naturally exists. The speed of this transformation is almost impossible to overstate. And it is part of what makes the modern Gulf so extraordinary and, in a sense, so precarious. Cities that elsewhere took centuries to grow rose here in decades within the span of a single human life. There are people still living who remember when Dubai was a modest town of coral stone houses and wind towers clustered along a tidal creek, its economy built on pearling and fishing. Its people living much as their ancestors had for generations, in careful accommodation with the desert and the sea. Those same people have watched, in the course of their own lifetimes, that town become a global metropolis of soaring towers and vast malls, its entire way of life transformed from one of adaptation to the desert into one of insulation from it. And this very speed meant that the transformation outran the slow accumulated wisdom that older civilizations developed over centuries of living in a place. The ancient adaptations were the product of long trial and error, refined across generations until they fit their environment closely. The modern bubble was built fast, with imported technology and imported labor. A solution applied to the desert rather than grown from an intimate understanding of it, and a solution imposed quickly from outside may prove more brittle than one grown slowly from within. But it is essential to understand exactly how this modern conquest was achieved, because the method contains the vulnerability the warming climate is now beginning to exploit. The ancient civilizations adapted to the desert. They worked with its constraints, building thick-walled houses and wind towers, organizing their lives around the cooler hours, always compromising with an environment they could not defeat. The modern Gulf did something fundamentally different. It did not adapt to the desert. It built an artificial world in which the desert could be ignored altogether. Two technologies made this possible: air conditioning, which created a vast cooled indoor civilization where people could live in comfort while lethal heat raged outside the glass, and desalination, which manufactured fresh water from the sea in enormous energy-hungry plants, freeing the cities from any dependence on the scarce natural water of the land. Together, these technologies did not tame the desert. They walled it out. They created a bubble of manufactured, temperate, water-rich civilization, held apart from the surrounding reality of extreme heat and absolute aridity by a continuous expenditure of energy. Inside the bubble, life could proceed as though the desert did not exist. Outside it, the desert remained exactly what it had always been, unchanged, unconquered, merely excluded. This distinction between adapting to the desert and walling it out is the key to everything that follows, because a wall, unlike an adaptation, must be actively maintained, and it can fail. The ancient adaptations were low-energy, self-sustaining accommodations that asked little and endured. The modern bubble is a high-energy, high-technology exclusion of the environment that demands enormous continuous inputs to sustain, and that reverts, the moment those inputs cease, to the raw desert conditions it was built to keep out. The temperate, water-rich world of the modern Gulf exists only so long as the air conditioning runs and the desalination plants operate, and the energy flows to power them. Cut off that flow, and within hours, the heat and thirst of the desert would come flooding back, because the desert never actually left, it was only held at bay. This is the profound and precarious truth at the heart of the modern conquest. It is not a permanent transformation of the land, but a continuous act of maintenance against an adversary that remains as powerful as ever, waiting just beyond the reach of the machines. And it is precisely this arrangement that the warming climate is now beginning to test, degree by degree. Here, then, is the turn in our story. The desert's reassertion is not the one the phrase "taking it back" might first suggest. The desert is not, for the most part, literally advancing with dunes to bury the cities. Its reassertion in the modern Gulf is subtler and more formidable because it comes not as sand, but as heat. The region is warming faster than the global average, its summers lengthening and intensifying, its extreme heat days multiplying, its nights failing to cool as they once did. And every increment of that warming ratchets up the pressure on the artificial bubble. This is what the phrase "degree by degree" so aptly captures, the reassertion of the desert happening not in a single dramatic event, but in a slow, cumulative, one-way climb of the temperature. What makes this so dangerous here is that the region is warming not from a comfortable baseline, but from one already near the edge of what human beings can survive. Scientists measure that edge with the wet bulb temperature, which combines heat and humidity to capture the point beyond which the body can no longer cool itself, a threshold around 35 degrees Celsius, and by newer research, perhaps closer to 31 for many people, past which even a healthy person at rest, in shade, with unlimited water, will overheat and die. The humid coasts of the Gulf are among the few places on Earth that, on their worst days, begin to approach this line, brushing against the outer edge of human endurance. When you are already operating near the absolute physiological limit, every additional fraction of a degree carries a weight it would not carry in a temperate place. The degrees are not abstract, they are increments of approach toward a hard physical limit, and each one matters more than the last. Consider what this rising heat does to the bubble. As temperatures climb, the demand for cooling rises, straining the power systems on which everything depends, precisely when those systems are already most stressed. The desalination plants must work harder, drawing from a warming, saltier Gulf. The season during which the outdoor world is uninhabitable stretches longer. And this brings us to the deepest vulnerability, the total dependence of the whole civilization on the uninterrupted operation of its machines. There is no natural fallback, no reserve of habitability to catch the civilization if the systems fail, because the whole point of the modern conquest was to dispense with adaptation in favor of exclusion. A failure of the power grid during a peak summer heat event would mean not discomfort, but mortal danger, as the cooled refuges heated rapidly toward the lethal temperatures outside, and the manufactured water faltered. The strategic water reserves the region has built, storing desalinated water underground against just such a disruption, are a tacit acknowledgement of exactly this vulnerability. An attempt to rebuild some of the resilience the natural environment once provided, and the artificial bubble discarded. The modern desert civilization is not a fortress, but a life support system, and life support systems, however sophisticated, carry the permanent risk of failure, a risk the warming steadily magnifies. It would be a serious distortion, however. To leap from this real vulnerability to a prophecy of imminent collapse, and honesty requires that we pull firmly back from that edge, because the desert is not winning, at least not yet. The Gulf states are not crumbling. They are, by most measures, thriving, growing, and adapting with formidable resources and genuine ingenuity. The very warming that presses on the bubble is being met with an accelerating effort to strengthen it. Investment in solar power to run the cooling and desalination without the fossil fuels that worsen the warming, more efficient technologies for producing water and cold, sophisticated planning for heat, the strategic reserves that hedge against catastrophic failure, and a slow return of the old wisdom of shade and passive cooling. Human ingenuity, which built the bubble in the first place, is fighting hard to keep it ahead of the rising heat, and so far, by and large, it is succeeding. The honest framing of the contest is not that the desert is triumphantly reclaiming a doomed civilization, but something far more genuinely uncertain, that the pressure is mounting, degree by degree, and whether human ingenuity can continue to keep pace with a steadily worsening climate is an open question, one whose answer will unfold over the coming decades. It is a contest, not a foregone conclusion, and to call it either a certain triumph or a certain collapse would be equally dishonest. The most promising path forward may lie in marrying the two great strategies, retaining the technological power to override the desert while reincorporating the ancient wisdom of adapting to it, a wiser coexistence rather than mere exclusion. There is, however, a dimension that any honest telling must include, because the desert's reassertion is not felt equally by all who live within the bubble. When we speak of the artificial civilization holding out against the rising heat, we must ask who is sheltered within it and who is left exposed at its edges. The deepest, most reliably cooled interiors shelter the wealthy and the citizens, for whom the rising heat remains, for now, largely an abstraction glimpsed through glass. But the bubble has a vast and exposed frontier, staffed by the millions of low-paid migrant workers who labor outdoors in the very heat everyone else is fleeing, building and cleaning and serving the cooled world from outside its protective walls. For these workers, the desert has never been fully walled out. They live at its reasserting edge, and as the heat intensifies degree by degree, it is they who feel it first and hardest, they whose bodies are pushed toward the limits of survivability, they who die, too often and too invisibly, of a heat the comfortable classes experience only as a number on a screen. There is a bitter injustice in it too, for these workers came from poorer countries with tiny carbon footprints and did least to cause the warming that now falls hardest on them. So when we say the desert is taking civilization back degree by degree, we must add that it is taking it back unequally, reclaiming first not the glittering towers, but the people pushed to the margins. Any account of the contest that focuses only on the skylines while ignoring the laborers in their shadow tells only the comfortable half of the story. Step back now and consider what all of this means beyond the Middle East itself, because the contest playing out in the region is a preview of a reckoning the warming world will increasingly face everywhere. The Middle East is simply the frontier, the place where the confrontation between civilization and an intensifying climate is furthest advanced, because it began from the hottest and driest baseline and chose the most complete and most energy-dependent form of conquest. But the fundamental question it faces, whether human ingenuity and wealth can keep a place habitable against a steadily worsening climate, is one that more and more of the world will confront. Other regions, today still temperate, will in time find their own environments growing more hostile, and they will face, in gentler and different forms, versions of the same contest. The Middle East is not an exotic special case, but an advance guard, living through early and intensely what the rest of humanity may live through later. Its lessons, the power of ingenuity and wealth to hold a hostile environment at bay, but also the fragility of doing so through exclusion rather than adaptation, and the cruel inequality of who is protected and who is exposed, are lessons the whole warming world would do well to study. So let us return, at the end, to the claim we began with and give it the full and honest answer it deserves. Did the Middle East build civilization in a desert? Yes, more completely and consequentially than anywhere else on Earth, twice over, first in the ancient cradle, where humanity invented settled civilization itself by mastering water in a dry land, and again in the modern age, where oil wealth and the technologies of cooling and desalination raised glittering cities where nature forbade them, And is the desert taking it back degree by degree? In a real and mounting sense, yes, the desert's fundamental condition, its extreme heat, is intensifying as the region warms faster than the world, pressing harder each year on the artificial bubble, raising the cost and the fragility of it, approaching the limits of survivability on the worst days, and falling first and hardest on the most vulnerable. The phrase captures the truth precisely. Not a sudden reclamation, but a slow, cumulative, one-way ratcheting of the heat against the defenses. But taking it back is not the same as has taken it back, and the desert is not winning. At least not yet. This is a contest still fiercely underway, met by an ingenuity and a wealth that have so far largely kept pace, its outcome genuinely uncertain. Neither the doom that alarmists proclaim, nor the permanent triumph the glittering skylines might suggest. The Middle East built the most audacious civilization in the harshest of lands, and now finds itself defending that achievement. Degree by degree, against the very desert it once thought it had finally conquered. Whether it can go on holding the line as the heat climbs and the stakes rise is one of the great open questions of the warming century, and it is a question whose answer, worked out on the front line of the desert, will echo far beyond the Middle East, to a world only beginning to feel the first faint pressure of the same ancient and patient adversary, reasserting itself everywhere, degree by degree.